So, for those of you who've just joined in the last minute or so, welcome so much to today's IEU Virtual Talk, which is entitled Using Behavioural Science to Mitigate Climate Shocks, a Case Study. I'll hand over to my colleague, Cortland, to introduce the presentation, and then we'll move over to Nate shortly. Over to you, Cortland. Thank you. So, IEU Virtual Talks are a companion to our lunch talks. So they offer a new outlet for speakers who are participating in our talk series, and it allows us to continue with the talks during the COVID-19 pandemic. So virtual talks increase understanding about the Independent Evaluation Unit of the GCF and GCF overall, and they cover topics related to climate change, evaluation, and development. And they're open to everyone who's interested in participating. So we encourage you to share information about these talks for people within and outside GCF and in your professional circles. So today we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Nathanial Peterson, Vice President at the Busara Center for Behavioural Economics, who's joining us from Nairobi, Kenya, which is the HQ of Busara. So Busara are an IEU partner, and they're supporting the IEU's work on behavioural science. For example, a forthcoming working paper by Cornelius Kruger and Joe Puri. And also they've been supporting a growing number of IEU researchers in terms of how behavioural science and behavioural change can be applied to climate evaluation and climate investments. So Nate himself is Vice President of Busara. He's a behavioural decision theorist where he focuses on how small farmers understand risk mitigation strategies, and technologies. And today's talk examines how Busara helped an agricultural insuretech firm improve the sale of crop insurance through a mixed incentive referral system. So Nathanial will discuss how Busara leveraged social and economic mechanisms to drive particular segments of farmers to refer others, resulting in thousands of smallholder farmers becoming insured against climate shocks. So the presentation today will last around 25-30 minutes, and this will leave about 25-30 minutes for questions. A couple of housekeeping points. The talk is recorded and is put on the IEU's YouTube channel. So please subscribe to this channel to keep up with all of our latest videos. And we also encourage you to tweet using the IEU handle at GCF_eval. And our event hashtag for our talk series is hashtag IEU Talks. So with that introduction, and we're privileged to hand over to Nate for the presentation, and I will help moderate some questions immediately afterwards. So please feel free to post your questions and your comments in the chat box. Over to you, Nate.
Many thanks, Martin. I will put up my screen now. Are you able to see this? I've successfully become the screen. Great, thanks so much. I'm also going to minimize the speaker talk. So as Martin said, today I'll be speaking about some of the work we've done in mitigating climate shocks, especially related to insurance here in Africa. So you'll first notice that the welcome screen says Mercy Corps, and that's because Busara often conducts research kind of as the learning agenda kind of monitor for various partner organizations, including Mercy Corps' AgriFin Accelerate program, who is one of our best partners and is the one most aligned with my interests. So always very excited to work with them. So Busara is a consultancy and a network of research labs that advances and applies behavioral science in the global South. So we have offices, our HQ, as Martin mentioned, is here in Kenya. We also have major hub offices in Nigeria and India, and then some other smaller satellite offices throughout mostly East Africa. But we work in usually 30 plus countries per year, including in Latin America and Southeast Asia. to click the screen. So behavioral science, just for those of you who may be new to this topic and here out of some fresh interest, is an analytical approach that uses, and this is where our focus comes in, locally embedded research to explain human decision-making. And we commonly use cognitive interviews where we're asking people about their thought processes, as well as experiments. So today, I will be speaking as one representative from a really fantastic partnership that was sponsored by the MasterCard Foundation with Pula, an insurance company that's based here in Nairobi, though works extensively across the continent, as well as Mercy Corps AgriFin Accelerate. There's a program that partners research with agribusinesses and companies like insuretechs to advance the development of smallholder farming, mostly in Africa. So we're talking specifically about social networks and agriculture insurance. One thing that you'll note in this presentation is that I will not be presenting an experiment, which is very different from Busara, but I did that on purpose because I wanted to help people understand why it's so important for us to properly contextualize and do the academic and case study literature reviews in advance so that our experiments can be the best they can be. So this is really about some of our analysis and problem identification and the bits of the engagement that led us to the experiment, which is ongoing. So just for a bit of context, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the area, agriculture index insurance is an insurance that essentially creates these mostly geographic-based risk pools, right? So we have farmers that are all in a similar area, so we know about what their rainfall looks like, and it's critical to bringing resilience to smallholder farmers, right? These farmers didn't create climate change; they're certainly suffering for it. And the way that we've approached this is that having insurance brought to them through the various inputs that they are acquiring is really critical to improve their livelihoods. So Pula, the company that we partnered with here, and we partnered with on a number of projects, including some very large projects with the Gates Foundation, they are an insuretech, so they kind of sit between the actual underwriter of the insurance and the smallholder farmer, and they really develop the products and partnerships to allow insurance to be brought to smallholder farmers where the margins on selling that insurance might not be there, or they might need to have other sorts of kind of strategies for reaching the farmers, partnering with seed and fertilizer companies, for example. And we're focusing here on referrals, as you might imagine, because with smallholders, especially in countries that are not very population dense, the last mile is really, really expensive, and in fact so expensive that it can eliminate the margins, right? So insurance becomes something that you can't make money on, in fact often make a loss on in these low density areas. So referrals are a way to utilize those local networks to improve uptake. So AFA had Busara do two things. So this presentation, which I will hopefully get through in 30 minutes, is split into two sides. The first is that we analyze data on Pula's referral system in Malawi and Zambia. And we were seeking to get these kind of insights for improving those social networks because, as you'll see in a minute, their conversion rate on referrals wasn't very high. And the other bit is that we then look to the research to find insights and recommendations for improving insurance uptake. And anyone who's interested in this topic, I have provided a link on these slides and can provide one more generally that will bring you to our literature review for referral-based uptake of products and services, especially related to insurance. So just really, really quickly, the referral system, it was new. It allowed farmers who were using a Pula insured maize seed. So the insurance was bundled with an actual seed product. And basically what happened is that customers who were registered as buyers of this seed could just send a text message or receive a text message about the referral process. And then they could either have their referrals processed, right? So if they had phone numbers to refer, they were processed via USSD menus through their phone or through an actual call center with real live people. And the senders received a small airtime incentive and a discount voucher for seed if they were to do this. And the people who received referrals and even outside parties could offer numbers. So they basically allowed anyone to enter referrals into the system to get the most possible people. And they actually had a really high volume of referrals, as many or more than they were expecting. But unfortunately, the conversion rate was really, really low. So only about 3% led to a sale in either Malawi or Zambia. So certainly not what they were hoping for. So on the analytics side, we wanted to understand how Pula could identify and encourage high quality referrals, or which factors were driving sales conversion. And so at this point, some of you who are interested in climate change and climate change communication might be thinking, this seems like very much a marketing presentation. And in fact, it is, because this sort of market research is the only way to understand how people are valuing mitigation strategies so we can get them into farmers' hands. And it's not always teaching them about climate change that is the most important part of that. So I won't read all these in detail, but some members of the audience, I'm sure, are technical, and when you glaze over the detail, they doubt you. So I've offered it here. But essentially, there were 115,000 referrals initiated across these two countries, and about 40% of them could actually have kind of phone number delivery. So they were legitimate in the sense that they weren't just made up phone numbers that people were offering. The kind of farmer in the middle offered about 4 referrals of other people. And so we had to throw out people who were offering more than 50, kind of on the presumption that they were just, spammers who had big phone number lists. And so that, yeah, 28,000 were sent by 170 senders. So you can do the math on that and realize that some people were just, kind of carpet bombing in a sense. So the analysis in our sample was about 17,500 unique referrals. And you can see a majority of those were in Malawi, just because the referral system had been open there, and Pula already had a bigger footprint in Malawi than in Zambia. So the data that we had information about the actual referrals, and then demographic and purchase data that were only available, for the senders and receivers who bought Pula insurance, right? So we basically didn't have information about people who came in through kind of other referrals, or may have heard about the product and were essentially secondary or secondhand referrers. So, as I said, there was a lot of people referring, but only 3% were coming through. And this was if we attribute every single purchase that could be paired, if their number was entered in the system, we gave them credit as kind of having been referred, right? Which may not have been the case. They may not have purchased simply because they were referred. It may have been because other reasons, but then they were also referred. We are including those in the 3% conversion. So this is kind of the most optimistic view of the situation. And you can see here that in terms of sales, Malawi was at 75,000, and they had about 44,000 referrals, and of those, about 1,200 actually converted into sales. So there were a couple of things that we wanted to understand about the referrals from a behavioral perspective. The first is just the timing of the referral. So we had limited data on the actual timing of referrals, in part because of how, like, when the call centers were open and how the referrals were processed. But it did show us, and I'll show you in a minute, that the timing of the referral was actually pretty important, right? So you think of being resilient to climate shocks as something that might be like a more overarching part of the perspective of a farmer when they're thinking about risk mitigation. But in fact, as with all decisions, there are times where we're more prone to act on things and actually take decisions to mitigate risk in this case. So our recommendation here is that we shouldn't be sending these SMSs at night, which is unfortunate because sometimes things are cheaper then, and really to time them with the beginning of the rainy seasons. And I'll show a little chart for that in a minute. But that's kind of the initial recommendation we had. We also wanted to ensure that the quality of the referrer, the person allowed to make the referral, was high enough, right? So we didn't end up with all of this essentially junk in our pipeline of referrals. And so what we wanted to do is encourage these larger purchasers to refer and kind of allocate resources away from these stranger referrals. So we were really wanting to focus on the best customers and the largest scale farmers. We realized that call centers versus USSD mattered a lot, but it depended on kind of the system structure, which I can get into in a minute as well. And so we were really hoping to isolate these high potential senders and then, follow up with them and treat them kind of like VIPs in the system because they really were generating a majority of the sales. And finally, we wanted to better understand the applicability of the referral. So just to see if the people who were being referred were actually farmers, if they had already planted and then they could even buy the seed that was bundled with the insurance. So we wanted to make sure that we were doing a better job of ensuring that the people being referred even were possible customers. So we identified 3 initial hypotheses. And again, these were generated by talking to people at Mercy Corps Agrifin Accelerate who had worked on other insurance projects with people at Pula and, based on our own experience. And we have noticed, of course, that smallholder farmers, many times for cash flow reasons, usually wait until right before they're going to plant to buy seeds. There are storage issues, cash flow issues, lots of reasons for that. On the messaging, the referral messages could increase both knowledge and salience of the products. But of course, salience dissipates quickly over time. So the knowledge component remains, but how fresh that is in someone's mind doesn't. And so we wanted to make sure that referral messages, to the greatest extent possible, were exactly when consumers were in the position, right? Just as they were seeing the rains come and might be going out to buy seed during the daytime, as I mentioned. And then finally, the farmer's ability to actually engage with the messages about the products varied a lot through the day. So we noticed that the best time to engage these farmers, or we noticed in our past work, was when they were on the farm or like literally on their way to purchase inputs, of course, right? And we also noticed that timing mattered. So we wanted to look at the total referrals as well as the conversion rate. So total referrals here, and we're looking at these by week through the kind of start of the rainy season. This is October 14th, December 16th, and we're splitting here Malawi on one side and then Zambia here on the right. And you can see the number of referrals, but you can also see the conversion rate. So we noticed that there was a big problem in kind of the later part of November where we were getting the bulk of our total referrals, but conversion rate was very, very low, in part because a lot of farmers had already planted. And so, they're not going to go buy new seed, dig up the seed they already planted and do another version. So we just recognized that, there were a couple of dates here that seemed to be most important for making the referrals, both in terms of having the people making the referrals available to do them, and then the conversion rate being, several times higher than the kind of subsequent weeks. And, again, Zambia was relatively small N. And so it was a bit harder to make conclusions about timing there, though we're in the process of follow-up. So again, I know I'm going through these very quickly. There's a time limitation, but I hope people are understanding the overall message here. Farmers were purchasing the seed both before and after, but the earlier referrals were obviously more successful. So, there was a huge effect of this in Zambia, less so in Malawi, but this was likely due to the fact that in Malawi, a lot of the farmers were planting after the rains begin. They were kind of waiting until, a little after the last minute. And so we really had to make sure that these referrals were being targeted to arrive just before the rains. I keep hitting that point because it's pretty critical. We also looked at the time of day. And we noticed that for whatever reason, Monday was a particularly good day in Zambia, possibly because of markets opening and these types of things. So something that, you see in the data and you have to get on the ground information to understand exactly why in this context that is particularly good. And so we of course followed up. And as you can see in this bullet, notice that Monday was indeed a market day in Zambia. So targeting farmers then could be really helpful. And of course, we did this time of day thing, and there was less variance, I think, than we expected. But of course, 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. was pretty low. So Pula programmed the SMSs to be delivered at 9, which was hopefully in the sweet spot. But the problem is that, of course, some of these were delayed either because of the SMS provider or, because people's phones were switched off until certain points in the day, maybe while they were eating or something. And so, you might think that some of these details, when you're working with an SMS provider, might not be important, but they can be really critical in terms of actually driving insurance, which is improving climate resilience. So something as strange as, how the bulk SMS provider is delivering messages can impact how resilient farmers are in a particular geography, which it's these details that are so critical to our work. In terms of farmer characteristics, we found that for the purchasers, we know that the size of their land, the varieties that they were planting, location, and whether someone is kind of designated as the lead farmer, one that is an example to other farmers, mattered a lot. So they were 23% of the referrers in Zambia, but only 0.4% in Malawi, which raised some questions. And so this is something that we couldn't understand in this initial phase of the research, why there was such a huge difference here. And so that's one thing that we advise Pula to follow up on in the immediate future. And so the kind of takeaway here is that receivers were much more likely to convert to sales if they were receiving a referral from a farmer that had kind of large scale and was perceived by the community to be doing well, which makes a lot of sense. But a trusted person in the network. So the source matters. Non-purchaser referrals, so people who made the referral to this product but had never purchased themselves were much less likely to convert. And so whenever we try to do referral systems, it can end up with a lot of this stuff coming in that you then have to process, and it can actually even degrade the value of the brand. If you have these random people suggesting a product to you out of nowhere. And so that was an important thing that we realized. And pure numbers in the funnel for referrals isn't always so critical. And we also noticed that conversion rates were higher when there was a first link in a network chain of referrals. So we could detect, if someone was referred by someone else and then they purchased and then they referred another person, that chain kind of, degraded a bit, possibly because, the primary referrer was in fact the kind of most respected farmer in the chain. Again, kind of the largest purchasers were the most effective at doing referrals. So we could look at this through different sizes of the seed bags that they were buying and determine, approximately what their land size was. We could derive that, as well as make some estimates about their cash flow and ability to actually purchase that much seed in the first place, which was definitely not the case for the majority of farmers. So, you saw in Zambia, those conversion rates were very, very high for people who were buying higher sizes of seeds. Again, best referrers were local, so the kind of closer in proximity the referral came from, the more likely it was to convert. This, I won't dwell on this too long, but it's great when the referrer knows the referee very well, and but they're kind of not close enough to inform the person in person, right? So it might be someone that is a couple of kilometers away where you can't just walk to your neighbor's house, because there were likely referrals already happening that way organically. And this is maybe a bit of a behavioral science buzzword, but choice architecture, the way that you frame an opportunity, is really context dependent. So conversion rate was much higher for referrals processed via call centers in Malawi, right? So this is, the green is a call center and the black is USSD. And you can obviously see that in these conversions. So this is didn't convert and did convert in Malawi and Zambia. So in Zambia, in Malawi, we saw the call center as really effective. In Zambia, we saw a minor benefit to USSD, which in Malawi hadn't been very successful. And we think that this was due to the fact that in Malawi, the call center had been instructed to call those who had been referred but not yet purchased. So there was some pretty good follow-up there. and it was effective but relatively high cost to be making all those individual phone calls, especially if there was a lot of kind of spam referrals in the system. But it could be a good process if you could remove those. So again, these are the things that you might not think to look at when you're trying to improve farmer resilience, but turns out that call center behavior is really important. So, we found these really interesting things, but then what we have to do is match this with our expertise and the case studies and the literature from behavioral science. So I'm just going to walk through 6 areas where we did a bit of this, maybe a bit more quickly. I think this stuff is fun, but due to time limitations. And again, there's a pretty extensive lit review, and I've posted the link here. If anyone wants access to it, I can send it over. So, we had to answer this: why is conversion rate so low? Either the quality of the referrals might be low because people are non-farmers, multiple numbers, people can't afford the improved seed anyway, or just low response by those referred because the timing is off. People are wary of these improved seeds and, kind of GMOs in some countries. And the referring parties was just a random person and not a valued expert or lead farmer. So, we thought of several different ways of approaching this, right? With the idea that we'd assess the plausibility of implementing any of these strategies with the Pula field teams and ultimately come with a kind of multi-tier approach to improving the referral. So the first one was thinking about incentive structure. So the idea was that by rewarding these high conversion, it will encourage more conversions, right? And also that we would put time limits possibly on referral responses. So we essentially just give people more incentive if the person they refer to actually purchase something. And in the literature, we know that, again, I don't have citations here, they're all in that lit review, but you'll see this very clearly demarked, that the rule of reciprocity, I give to you, you give to me, can be used as a great reward. And it was pretty effective, we later learned. And there's also the pressure of time constraints works in a number of domains. So we thought about either having a lottery where the quality referrers were kind of randomly selected and rewarded, so that kind of give them this additional incentive without getting to be too expensive. We thought about shifting incentives to the referred. So in typical referral systems, you give money or airtime, whatever it is, to the person who is providing you with a new name. But the idea here was that especially if those farmers were already perceived to be kind of larger and wealthier, and they were maybe doing this as a social good because they wanted to improve the productivity and the climate resilience of their neighbors, that we could actually help them do that by allowing that incentive to either go to the person they were referring or to be split between them. And again, kind of time caps and also thinking about stepping up the incentives as people move to higher levels of conversion. So again, I'm flying through these. I think typically we spend like 20 minutes on each slide because people like to talk about these ideas. So hopefully this is just a tantalizer. Thinking a lot about non-monetary incentives, especially in last mile distribution and agent networks. These are something that we always have to understand because we simply don't have endless money to reach people, especially if we hope for products to become sustainable in the market. So the idea here is just that we could provide some type of social recognition of people who are making really great referrals. So public recognition of the high value referrals, kind of boost their reputation as these experts and lead farmers in their communities. We could have a SMS indicator that's kind of tells you the value of the referrals that you're making, and lets people around you know how well you're doing. And then finally, just kind of an SMS to the high quality referrals, just to acknowledge their contribution, right? Thank you, you've helped to bring climate resilience to your fellow farmers, where we expect higher productivity in your area across time as a result. Thanks for helping us. As I mentioned a number of times, this kind of situational targeting is really important. So try to aim referrals for times when people are making decisions. This could be at a product or service collection point, or people are actually thinking about the economic decision-making in their farm. And the referral could request kind of at any time of interaction, so they can make the claim there. So the idea is that we needed to more precisely target their customer journey with a couple of options coming to mind immediately. One is that they're kind of validation points where the seed bags were delivered. So the beneficiary, the person receiving the insurance and the seed, would validate the kind of insurance claim and show everyone that they kind of purchased this insurance and were receiving a benefit because they made a claim. And you could also do this at kind of the value addition points, like where there were extension worker visits or something else that were helping the farmers. And so the idea of the information being partnered with the actual product offering is really strong. And then just at initial points of registration, because these insurance products have to be registered on index insurance so that we know where the farmers are and how to make their claim, give them the incentive for their claim if necessary. Another one was providing people with decision aids. So, giving something to the people making referrals, especially the really great ones, so that they could kind of improve the conversion rates by being able to better explain the benefits of the products. And also maybe thinking about some goal setting so that, if they said, I recognize that these seeds are important, I want my neighbors to take them up because they'll make our community, more resilient. And so, I say I'll provide, 140 referrals, and then you can kind of, remind them of those goals to help improve the number of people that they send. So yeah, that one I think is pretty straightforward. Another thing we wanted to do is to drive more information sharing. And so it's not just about providing phone numbers, but actually getting information about the products. And so we could have group conversations on the insured seeds as an avenue for information. So trying to promote, like WhatsApp conversations, SMS conversations about, why this product, did people have good luck before, and to create more of a community conversation around these, and even, find that there may be debates arising or people who think that they're of low value or in some way bad. And so we can also monitor those discussions to understand what the biggest, kind of perceived risks or value proposition issues are along the way. So that, it's not just, so this is kind of an intervention, but also a monitoring strategy in that sense. Another one is that we could focus more on feedback. So kind of getting feedback from the referrers on the referrals to make them accountable. So, we were telling them, here are the people you sent us. They had really low conversion rate. Some of them weren't farmers, or, they were fantastic. And a number of them bought, you're doing really well. And so we could also give them, if they were kind of not referring the best people, and we had an incentive scheme that was linked to the quality of their referrals, we could give them advice on how to improve the quality of information and the way that they're positioning that to people. So, this kind of leads us to some insights and recommendations. We realized that we needed a deeper evaluation of the referral system because we only had this kind of transactional information, and we could derive things from it based on unregistered customers and people who later purchased things. But we didn't know, for example, why people who, were referred and maybe at the exact right time and it was perfect, why they still didn't buy, right? Especially if they were maize farmers. So we needed to kind of look into the non-buyers who had this information and understand why not, if it was just, a cost issue or something else. We also realized that non-purchasers shouldn't be incentivized. So people who are making referrals without having ever purchased a product that was insurance linked shouldn't be given any incentive under any circumstances. And again, we can't really prevent them from making referrals, but we can, after the referrals come in, kind of weed them out. We also realized that we needed to time the sales and product recommendations for a few days after the rain started, when people were confident now that it was the right time to plant, especially in Malawi. And that despite all these limitations, we realized that there were these really important large farmers who all of the neighbors paid attention to, and that we should really be focusing almost all of our energy on ensuring that they understand the products and their benefits and are able to make really effective referrals and get the social value, both in terms of providing something nice to their neighbors and in terms of being recognized for doing so, as well as possibly some financial incentive for doing that. So, we recommended to Pula to target particular market days, deprioritize these referrals from non-purchasers, try a split incentive system where you're giving something to both the person making the referral and the person receiving it, because they're obviously doing this in some way to provide a benefit to their neighbors. So we should help them with that. Focus on these large scale buyers and then make the top referrers aware of each other, right? And so to kind of create more of a social network around these larger scale farmers who were making high conversion referrals. So anyway, I will stop there. This presentation has an annex with more detail as well as literature review. So more than happy to share these things afterwards, but I think we're moving to questions now, and I'm prepared for some difficult ones.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nate, for a very, very detailed and also fascinating presentation. And we've had a number of questions come into the chat box. The first is from Gaynor. Is insurance limited to the multinational company who is promoting the seed? So a bit more information about the insurance there that's being referred.
Yeah, that's an excellent question and one that we deal with often. So there are a couple of answers to this. In some countries, there's not a lot of kind of subsidy programs and other things that allow partnerships between insuretechs and the fertilizer or companies. So in those places, oftentimes they're relying on these large scale seed producers or fertilizer producers. In some countries, the insurance products can be much more linked to government programs, such as in Nigeria has NAIC, which is kind of a parastatal insurance body, as well as some other kind of farmer risk mitigation programs. And so in those cases, they try to make direct entry that's not necessarily product linked. The problem with insurance is that it's a really difficult thing to explain to people, like, you're part of this risk pool, it's probabilistic. If it doesn't rain, we'll pay you. And there can end up being a lot of problems with people wanting their premiums back at the end of the year and these types of things. And so typically insurance is actually been realized to be more of an added benefit to a novel product than a standalone value proposition that people are willing to pay for out of pocket without being linked to something. And so, yeah, the answer is that this is what ends up happening pretty often, but it's not necessarily required. I hope I answered that thoroughly.
I think you did, and it was a longer answer than I was expecting. Absolutely. And we also got a question. We also received a question from Andreas. So Andreas asks, what can the GCF take from this in terms of project design for climate investment, especially in terms of closing the intention action gap? So what can the GCF take from this presentation in terms of project design?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and one I was very much hoping to be asked. So one of the critical issues here, and why I even framed this presentation as I did, is to help. Oftentimes when you talk, no offense to anyone on the call, but when you talk to climate scientists or other people who are experts, I work in agroforestry pretty extensively and talk to a lot of scientists in that space. And what you find is that people are really focused on helping. If farmers could only understand the risks, they would take mitigation strategies. But it's not always as simple as that. And in some cases, you actually have to think about these kind of grassroots marketing campaigns really as the best way, right? You might have to ignore the greater principles or hope to communicate those over time and really focus on getting people, these products in the first place. And so I think the GCF should be really thoughtful about, making sure that they're funding both companies who are doing this and also suites of companies, right? So we've seen a lot of platforms emerge that are providing, inputs and off-taking and extension services, education services to farmers, along with, these kind of critically linked products like insurance. And I think that, through work of a number of different parties, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa and India and Southeast Asia, that we're seeing a lot of great learning about how these platforms should look. And I think the GCF should continue focusing on these kind of full information and product and service delivery suites that platforms can provide.
Thank you, Nate. We received a further question from Gaynor, which relates to the Leave No One Behind agenda in relation to the SDGs. So has there been consideration of the inclusion of all social groups within this referral system, or how was this integrated in the intervention?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in this particular one, this was more just data analysis. They kind of offered a broad, sweeping, very open referral system to see what they would catch. And then the idea was that, we'd use these interventions to approach people. In the first case, what we try to do is just to really hit that critical mass of people who are buying insurance-linked products. And so honestly, in some of those cases, the inclusion isn't as much the focus as just creating product awareness, through these larger scale farmers. But typically what we do, sometimes linked to that where possible, is to target groups that are, especially at risk. And so sometimes we'll work with like women's cooperatives, or there'll be like new farmer cooperatives. So youth who have kind of, they were trying to be an Uber driver in the city and they've instead decided to try farming, and to really target people who are maybe don't understand quite why risk mitigation strategies are important. And so in the second phase of our interventions and testing is when we go for this. But I will say that both Pula and Acre Africa, which is another kind of index type in insurance, though there's some critical differences between the two companies, they are really, really focused on this inclusivity principle in their kind of approach to market strategy, especially in countries that need risk mitigation so desperately, like Nigeria.
Okay, thank you for that, Nate. Thank you for that detailed question. Edward asks, it seems that the analysis simply uses quality microdata. Could we clarify what exactly makes this behavioural economics? And I think you responded to that in the second half of the presentation, but I'll just give you an opportunity now to perhaps.
No, that's a great question. So part of the problem is that we sometimes try to jump to experiments and figure out our nudges right away. And oftentimes, especially in these complex risk environments, there's not enough understanding of like the basic decision context and even the types of infrastructure that are there for people to interact in, right? So like, how would we have guessed, if you brought this to, me when I was a behavioral economics PhD student, I would have just, started citing literature, and I wouldn't think to ask about USSD versus call center. And so the point of this presentation is that we're trying to understand the infrastructure into which we are placing our nudges and doing our experiments later. So this is kind of like laying the groundwork for actually doing behavioral economics, which is the second stage.
Thank you. I think that was really helpful. That was really a really good clarification. Thank you for that. Cornelius, a colleague here in the IEU, asks, what are some practical approaches to identify and upscale the most effective interventions, the most successful and effective interventions that you highlighted?
Yeah, so amazingly enough, we often find a lot of the harnessing the intuitive knowledge of field agents, especially people who are doing this last mile distribution, is really, really important. And so typically, if you just have an upscaling approach to kind of do like a small survey of the field agents and try to see if there are some best practices or hunches about maybe some barriers to the process that are embedded, and then to experiment with those is the most important part. But oftentimes, after we can find these mechanisms, we have to assess them for the kind of plausibility of scale in the first place, often due to cost constraints and due to kind of, we might have a big grant right now, but will this be a sustainable approach to the market going forward? If we do something that's like a really intense nudge, right? Like we're going out and talking to farmer cooperatives for 2 hours about insurance, that's great. And it might drive uptake for a little while. But so there are all these trade-offs. I typically think that finding these relatively organic processes like referral systems and trying to optimize them with like very subtle changes in terms of who's being incentivized and how we're sharing information with the group are by far the most cost effective, even though they're not always the most powerful in terms of like a 6-month time frame.
Thank you, and that was a really great response. Thank you for that. Yonji, another colleague in IU here, asks, did referrers have a convincing argument for why people should consider purchasing the insurance? And was the argument done in relation to climate resilience or climate change? Mm-hmm. And if you do know, if you do know the arguments that the referrers used, which or if you know the range of arguments that were used by referrers, which of these was most effective for getting referrals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we think in many cases, the conversations, even neighbor to neighbor, and I've seen this. I'm speaking beyond this specific project. I've done a huge number of crop insurance projects. Is that oftentimes there's just kind of a mimicking of the largest scale farmer, and we often see these lead farmer models where you find this person who's got really great productivity and then try to tell everyone to copy them. But oftentimes people can't, right? They might not have an irrigation system. There's not a borehole there. They might not be on this perfect sunny slope, that catches just the right amount of rainfall and lets the rest go, in times of that other farmers might flood. And so, leveraging the lead farmer, but in like the tiny ways, right? So if you see that this farmer is purchasing a seed product that is maybe 12% more expensive than the one you're purchasing, and then you see a couple of these larger scale farmers doing that, that's kind of an example that, assuming cash flow, you can follow. And so I don't think it's so much the argument as setting the example from people who are perceived to be more productive, because ultimately these conversations almost never boil down to any discussion. Like, you will not hear climate in these discussions, right? You might hear the word drought. You might hear the word locust if you're in Kenya or Ethiopia these days, but you almost always are thinking about this in terms of longer term, productivity and ultimately income. And so, they're more likely to buy the same seed product as someone who has a nice house than someone who has made the best, climate resilience argument.
Thank you for that, Nate. Patrick's got a really useful question as well. What cross-country differences in treatment effects might we expect to observe? And if I remember rightly, around in Zambia, you had around 23% of lead farmers ended up referring, whilst in Malawi I think it's 0.4%. So there was a real difference there, and it'd be interesting to hear how those differences perhaps drove some of the findings you had.
Absolutely. So there are some pretty significant differences when you're talking about insurance and information sharing between farmers as two separate categories. So on in the insurance side, we will often find that, certain governments are more likely to link products, or they'll be subsidized for a while and then go away. And it can create a lot of huge differences in the perceived value or perceived, the conception of who should be paying for the insurance, right? Is this something that some NGO should be providing me, or is it something that I'm willing to pay an extra couple of % on my bag of seed? And so we see really massive differences, even year to year in the same countries, but certainly across countries, based on subsidies and government programs. And then, I think pertaining to this specific instance, there are kind of farming communities that, especially around certain value chains, are extremely well organized, and they have much more socially integrated cooperative systems where there's much more just discussion of practices, discussion of financing. It might even be linked to church groups and other community organizations. And so we often see really great organic sharing there, which I think is what needs to be leveraged kind of the most easily for last mile distribution of these really low margin products. And so, yeah, but that can differ, right? It's not even necessarily across country. It could be within counties in Kenya, depending on their population density and overall productivity for maize in this example. So that's why, context ends up mattering so much. And what we try to do in these studies is to find the 5 or 6 attributes of context that we can kind of most quickly and easily measure, so that when we're bundling these interventions together, that we can, as we go in our learning are putting the right ones together for the right context. But I answer that in a bit of a broad way, but that's how I see it.
Okay, thank you for that, Nate. Anushri has got a further question, and is wondering if any of the recommendations have been rolled out by the company, because you've offered a series of suggestions to the company, and have any of these been rolled out? And if so, has any data come in terms of success or a need for sort of evolving that approach?
Yep. So speaking directly to these larger lead farmers, just having the normal field agents or the agents for the seed company speaking to these farmers and helping them to understand why their referrals are so important has been effective. I can't speak directly to specific numbers. These are private companies, but we saw slightly degraded conversion of the referrals because these larger scale farmers are referring more people. And so they're probably going down the list a little bit more in terms of the quality of people and the appropriateness. But in general, right, by taking out the people who are offering basically worthless spam and focusing on these farmers, the overall conversion, has gone way up despite the actual number of referrals, falling by 70%. And so, these are the examples that, you're really recognizing that you're kind of separating the wheat from the chaff, to go with some nice agriculture analogies.
Thank you, Nate. That's great. And we've got one final question before we wrap up here. So that's from Patrick, and he was wondering around spillovers and contamination between groups if this was implemented in an experimental, randomized experimental design.
Yes, that is a phenomenal question and a problem that I face every single day. These, especially in countries, like Kenya, where I am, and other countries that are being much more digitized, right? So we're bringing the supply chain to these market platforms, or people are at least on WhatsApp groups to chat, or on Facebook to make market linkages for sales, even if it's not even their account. Spillovers are just absolutely inevitable, and they're so strong and consistent that they can be difficult to measure. The one thing we know is that in rural communities, the social networks are really deeply ingrained. They're kind of multimodal. They're not just talking about farming. They're talking about finance. They're talking about perceptions of the county's management and government practices. And so we try to kind of cluster these effects geographically to the extent we can. But especially during COVID, there's been a lot of kind of urban to rural migration. People were in Nairobi for jobs, or for to be an Uber driver, and then they went back up country to farm. And so now it's become a lot more difficult to rely on that assumption that we could just geographically cluster to understand that error for the stats people. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, honestly, right now, but if Patrick would like to speak, I'm all ears.
That's a really good response and a really interesting insight into some of the challenges around the COVID pandemic in terms of the work that you're pursuing there in Kenya. Yep, we've had one final question from Yonji, who wonders, would it be good for the GCF, for example, to engage more with marketing experts who use behavioral insights on a daily basis to improve project implementation on the ground? And it would be great to get your reflections on that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I personally, work with kind of a customer experience, customer journey company in Kenya myself, kind of, in my spare time, in part because I think that they're much more on the cutting edge of thinking about, especially how we're doing digital communication with people. And then we work with Busara itself, will subcontract marketing research companies to go in and understand some of these communities, right? Because it's not always that we just want the response to their perception of risk, right? We might want to know like the lighting density in that community, right? Because it'll tell us maybe something about distance to market that we couldn't measure very well otherwise. And so a lot of these market research companies actually have really, really rich data on the economic infrastructure that's surrounding a farmer and allows them access to these risk mitigation strategies. So I think, honestly, if you don't understand the basic market research in communities, that it can be a challenge. And of course, the degree to which this information is available it varies about as widely as possible. In Kenya, we know almost everything about Kiambu County, for example, which is where I live. Whereas, in some of these places in rural Malawi, some of them haven't really had outsiders come into these communities for years. And so, collecting that data is a challenge. And I think there are, just getting on my soapbox for 1 minute, there are some communities, especially with respect to agriculture, that are so overstudied because it's easy. And I'm in one of them. And I'm one of the people contributing to this. But there are lots of really important geographies where we need to much better understand economic infrastructure so that we can be making appropriate recommendations for climate mitigation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that insight. And thank you all ever so much for your questions and contributions. And I think Nate's done a great job of presenting the case study, but also responding to this very wide range and varied set of questions. So I'm sure that you'll join me in thanking Nate for giving the presentation for today's virtual talk, and for sort of generating such an interesting and vibrant debate. The next virtual talk that the IEU will be putting on will be part of the IEU side events for B27 during the week commencing the 9th of November 2020. And in the meantime, we'd love you to learn more about our simplified approval process assessment. So please log into our YouTube channel, watch the video, and continue engaging with the IEU. So thank you so much for participating today, and thank you, Nate, for such a stimulating and very detailed presentation. And there's a lot for us to learn in this, and we very much appreciate the content and the time that you've taken. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks.